Hello, I'm Dr. Atanuhuya, Assistant Professor at the School of Business, IIT Guwahati, in the area of operations. So this research focuses on a very important but overlooked component of urban mobility systems, the informal transport services. Informal transport services includes shared auto rickshaws, minibuses, shared vans, e-rickshaws, and many other personally owned operated services that are commonly seen in India and many other developed countries. These informal transport services are particularly important in cities where the formal transportation systems is either insufficient or not adequate in meeting that last mile connectivity. So for some commuters, which actually involves a large mass of the total commuters, commuting with these informal transport services may just be the only options, especially when they don't own their own vehicles. However, these informal transportation services are often operating outside the gambit of the formal policy framework. That's mostly because this is very severely under researched, and also resultantly the policymakers have very limited idea of how to deal with the operations of these informal services. Because of that, in spite of their the benefits, the utility that they provide, the one kind interventions that we see is the most common is a laissez-faire policy, where there is no intervention, or sometimes there are attempts to remove them completely or terminate them completely, which basically violates that sustainable transportation contribution that these informal transport services bring, which is in line with the Sustainable Development Goal 11 for sustainable cities. On the other hand, we have people who own cars increasingly. So just like the West, we are also now witnessing like a remarkable growth in, not in a very good way, growth in private vehicles, which is contributing to a lot of traffic related problems in terms of congestion, noise pollution, or other emission issues. So what if the question we ask is, what if the government focuses on not eliminating or marginalizing this informal transportation system, and instead focus on integrating them into a more with the formal transport urban transport systems. So this is the research questions that we try to address through our game theoretic model, through a stylus model, where we are considering a number of stakeholders that constitute the urban mobility framework. So the main stakeholders in our system, in our model, is firstly the government, which makes the policy. Secondly, we consider a informal transport aggregator, which is like a more organized form of alternative to the otherwise fragmented informal transport operators. And then we have a ride hailing platform, which is basically the app-based cab services, which can be shared or individual, which act as a competing mode to these informal transport system. And then we have the personal cars of commuters who own their own vehicles. So the commuters, which is one of those stakeholders, we don't consider them as identical as well. So we consider them in three segments. The first segment is the captive user segment, who usually are from lower socioeconomic background and do not have access to their own or ownership of their own vehicles. So they are stuck or captive to using informal transport systems. Some of them might also prefer, based on urgency or need, the ride hailing platform, but they do not have personal vehicles. Then we have a second segments, which are non-captive users. They usually might or might not have their own vehicles, in which case they also might choose to use ride-hailing platform, but they are never going to use informal transport systems. And then we have a third category, which we call captive by choice users. They might have access to their own vehicles, but they can use both ride-hailing as well as informal transport system based on how attractive these informal transport systems are to them in terms of certain attributes. I also needed to highlight, in spite of why is this attitude of the policymakers towards informal transport system, because in spite of providing this last mile connectivity and affordable services to commuters, they are known for being erratic. They are known for being compromised in safety, reliability, and inconsistent service quality. So the model that we develop, the base model, is based on what we usually observe, which is a laissez-faire policy response, where the government has no intervention in the transport system. So then we have the two mobility service provider and the personal vehicles, and then we have some extensions to this base model, where which we define based on three policy levers. The first policy lever is the congestion pricing that is introduced by the government for the personal vehicle users. And then we have the subsidy, which is provided to the informal transport system because recognizing their sustainable and inclusive mobility provision. And then we have the subsidy for the users of the, first is the operators, then we have the users of the informal transport system. So using these policy levers, we basically develop this stylized model, which gives us certain interesting findings, that a combination of these three policy levers can allow for the government, depending on what the government wants. Like it can be welfare. The government can be focused on increasing the welfare of the commuters, so increasing the consumer surplus and the welfare, overall welfare of the society, so that it is more inclusive, the transportation is available for all. Or it can be focusing on keeping their budget. So for example, so if we have a subsidy only policy, it affects the the government budget, so it is only depleting the resources of the government. And so and if we just introduce congestion pricing, it is able to somehow maybe reduce the private vehicle usage, but then it does not provide a proper alternative option for the commuters. So with a proper combination of these levers, we find that one of the models where we introduce a user subsidy, so that allows in increased ridership of these informal transport systems. If the model, the condition, the situation in which there is congestion pricing and operator subsidy, it allows the informal transportation operators to improve the service quality, so that then they compete better with their competing modes. So basically, depending on what the government has objective, whether to be providing more sustainable mobility solutions, or more welfare, or more budget conscious policy interventions. So we can have a combination, different kind of policy interventions. So the main finding is that that we can, through this kind of intervention, we can still keep the informal transport systems within the formal policy transportation policy framework, while also enabling what we have already proposed, to increase the sustainable mobility provisions that they are they are good for, while also protecting or preserving the the informal transport systems. And yeah, so otherwise yeah, so that is the main finding, and also it helps us to achieve that sustainable development goal that I mentioned. So 11, basically more specifically 11.2.1, which speaks about the sustainable and inclusive mobility for all, so which highlights this informal transport system as a major enabler of sustainable mobility. So in this model of 4 stakeholders, we have the government, who is the policy maker. So the government intervenes through these 3 policy levers. Based on this intervention, then we have the informal transit aggregator, who sets the price based on this intervention. Based on that, the ride-hailing platform also set their prices. So based on these options that we have in the mobility market, the commuters then make their choice of which mode to use. So basically the choice of these commuters depend on the service quality of the mode they are using, and also the pricing. It's not just the pricing but also the service quality. And there's also a third thing that I introduced, is the hassle cost. That is the inconvenience associated with each mode that the commuter might face. So hassle cost can also be associated with driving your personal vehicle, in terms of parking and maintenance and etc. And of course we have inconvenience with other ride hailing, with waiting time and other waiting time or communication issues, etc. So that is the decision sequence, so which highlights the game theoretic modeling aspect of our modeling framework. So yeah, so that was the point of our research. What we can move ahead with this research overall is to conduct some pilot studies to verify and actually try and see if these kind of interventions is giving the outcomes that we have proposed. So that is on the works, which also will take substantial time, effort and budget. So that is our future goals in research wise.